I believe we left off on this slide. So the leader of the Vietnamese Communist Party, its creator, was Ho Chi Minh on the left. As a young man, he had traveled to Paris. Vietnam had been a French colony in the late 19th century and up until World War II. So when it was still a colony, he had traveled there, was educated there. He'd actually gone to the Soviet Union for a time because he was a Marxist and again, a communist. So the Communist Party was formed in 1930, and the Viet Minh, the movement for independence, that he also formed, came in 1941 during World War II. Ho Chi Minh is a remarkable figure in world history. He was absolutely dead set on achieving independence for Vietnam and was an able figure. He was ruthless to some degree, but he radiated a certain charisma to just about everyone that met him, at least that commented on it, and we have records of what they said. He said at one point, to secure peace is not an easy task. It is a long and complex struggle. So this Vietnamese communist leader was not just a communist, but he was intent on bringing independence from France and then Japan, and the Vietnamese hadn't been independent in a long time. So this was his quest to achieve independence, and at the same time, or right just thereafter, make turn the country into a communist regime with a socialist economy. The Vietnamese Communist Party platform, which you see here, adopted the same year that the party was founded. Much of it just seems like basic fairness and justice to us today. Some of these things are democratic. So the 10-point plan, see at the bottom, included equality for women, universal education, unfair taxes to the poor eliminated, 8-hour working day. But there are a couple of rather extremely radical parts of it here. Number 5, confiscate all the property of reactionary Vietnamese capitalists. That couldn't have made the capitalists comfortable when they saw number 5, even if they were okay with some or all of the others. Number 4, confiscate the businesses of imperialists and put them in the state's hands. So that's where you primarily see the commitment to Marxist dogma and to a socialist economy. But number 2 and number 1 are also about overthrowing imperialism and bringing about independence for Vietnam. When World War II ended, the French had designs on getting their old colony back. The French had basically been driven out by the Japanese, who overtook all of Indochina at the outset of World War II. But after Japan was defeated and sent packing, France decided to get its colony back. The United States, which was on record and had been for many years as being anti-colonialist or anti-imperialists, meaning they were against colony or countries like France having colonies. You might think then that the U.S. would oppose the French effort. Not only did they not oppose it, the United States actually funded and paid for about 80% of the French war effort because Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh, his movement for independence, was declared independence for Vietnam just at the end of World War II as the Japanese were driven out. And he had an army that he planned to use, if necessary, to make good on his promises to his followers and to the Vietnamese people. So why did the United States support France getting its colony back when it was an avowed opponent of colonialism? Well, the exception all the time to American opposition to colonialism and imperialism was communism. So if the country in question, in this case Vietnam, is threatened by a communist takeover, then the U.S. would rather have an old-fashioned capitalist European world power like France in control than an indigenous communist movement. So the main reason that the U.S. funded the French in this long, bitter, what turned out to be a 9-year war, was not because they loved the idea, but they thought it was better than communism. Remember from earlier in the class that during the Cold War, and this is during the Cold War, that American leaders, anywhere they saw communism, they believed the Soviet Union was behind it, and were, vowed to oppose through the policy of containment. And as happened, in fact, both the Soviet Union and Communist China did support this war in one way or another, even into the parts where the United States gets involved militarily. So the 9-year war between the French, thousands of troops sent there to reclaim their colony, and the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh and his generals, particularly General Giap, kind of the genius of guerrilla warfare of his day, and they did fight using primarily guerrilla tactics in this war. But for a time, it wasn't clear who was winning the war. But as the years sort of went on, France was being worn down by guerrilla fighters, guerrilla tactics. That's mainly what guerrilla warfare intends to do, is to wear down the other side. Guerrilla fighters, guerrilla armies fight that way because they can't match the firepower of the other side, or when they can't match the firepower, they fight that way. And then instead they do hit and runs, small-scale attacks, surprise attacks, setting traps, ambushes, attacking at night, hitting supply lines, assassinating leaders, and on and on. So this started to wear on French morale. The French public, French politicians at home started to ask questions about when is this going to end? How many more lives is it going to cost? How many more years is it going to take? How much more money is this going to cost? And so there was pressure for them, the French military and government, to put an end to this. And you can see it in the final campaign of this long war at a place called Dien Bien Phu in 1954 in northern Vietnam, not too far from Hanoi. But the French actually intentionally airlifted about 13,000 troops into a valley, more or less, with the high ground all around them, which generally you don't do in a war if you can help it, and fortified their positions and basically dared the Vietnamese to attack them, thinking that they just had too much firepower for their garrison to be overrun. But the Vietnamese, instead of attacking them immediately, spent weeks and weeks and more dragging as much weaponry as they could, artillery pieces through the jungle, until when they finally did attack, they had fire superiority over the French, meaning probably for the first time in the war, they had more weapons and sort of more on their side than the French did. And this was the one big time in the war where then they fought something other than a guerrilla type battle. They went sort of traditional here because now they have the advantage, which the French handed them by putting themselves in a defensive position surrounded by hills. And the garrison at Dien Bien Phu, the soldiers there on the French side, were in a hellish nightmare once the attack began. Day after day, the Vietnamese attackers took fortified position after fortified position until there wasn't much left of the garrison, and when all was said and done, overran the entire garrison. So this is an utter disaster for the French military. And after this, because the public back home in France, the many of the politicians had already been questioning, whether this war should be continuing. This was kind of the final straw, and the French government decided then to leave Vietnam, and it looked at that point like Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh had achieved independence. General Giap was a master of guerrilla warfare, sometimes referred to as irregular warfare. One expert on guerrilla warfare says, few military leaders of conventional or guerrilla forces have records of accomplishment that can come close to Giap's. He truly marched to the beat of a different drummer, the one that guides the master of the irregular. So he's one of the great guerrilla fighters, really, of all time, and it showed in the war against the French in particular. As one historian says in a great book on Vietnam, now somewhat old, about 15, 20 years old, by Marilyn Young, professor at New York University, she says, in a war, if you're a big country and you win, you get what you fought for. But if you're a little country and you win, you get what the larger countries say you get. And what happened next showed that principle, I think, clearly. The major powers were to meet in Geneva to some degree already anyway, but this sped things up when the emergency situation came about when the French evacuated Vietnam, because of course the Americans were alarmed that a communist group was about to take over the entire country. So the major powers met, and they had to compromise, because it included the United States and the British, but on the other side the communist Chinese and the Soviet Union. So in the end, what they decided to do, at least temporarily, was to divide Vietnam into two, a northern half and a southern half. The northern part would be in the hands of Ho Chi Minh and a government that he would and did form. So this is the concession that Americans had to make. They didn't want Ho Chi Minh to rule any of Vietnam, but they had no choice since he'd been so successful on the ground, and he had communist backers, two of the major powers of the world. But it was also stipulated, the southern half of Vietnam was left open to some type of government that would be non-communist, but the blanks on what it would be, what it would look like, would be filled in, and pretty much became the creation of the United States as it started to get filled in. But there was also a piece of the Accords, the Geneva Accords, as the agreement that was eventually reached, that said that within 2 years, or 2 years into this, the people of Vietnam would get to vote, North and South, and decide whether they wanted to permanently stay two separate countries or whether they wanted to unite. And the Americans somewhat fudged this and didn't totally sign on to it in the end. But they participated enough where they at least gave tacit assent to the agreement. But nonetheless, the Americans realized quickly that allowing elections to take place would go against their interests and benefit the communists. But the U.S., to some degree, created South Vietnam. Not completely, but it certainly backed particular leaders. The president of Vietnam, President Diem, had been living in New Jersey before this, and he basically was installed by the U.S. government. Here he is shaking hands with President Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles. He was, at least it seemed at the time, perfect for American needs, with a communist country just to the north, and communist China nearby as well, because Diem was very pro-American, very anti-communist, and very pro-capitalist. So all these things, lend themselves to his being installed as leader. He came from a wealthy, traditional, land-owning class in Vietnam, so a rich guy, and so his government was the one supported by the United States, and the United States then sent assistance, aid, money, eventually weapons to fend off the communists as a war got underway. Because since he was seen by much of the South Vietnamese populace, President Diem, that is, as kind of a puppet of the Americans, which wasn't entirely true, but there's some truth to it. Many South Vietnamese, didn't see him as a legitimate leader, didn't see his government as legitimate at all. In the countryside, where the peasantry lived, small farmers, and the country was overwhelmingly made up of rural peasant farmers, the Diem government was extremely unpopular. In the cities, the big city capital of South Vietnam, Saigon, the government was a bit more popular. There were, businessmen and businesses and, capitalists there, and so they were okay with, or in favor of, this regime that was pro-capitalist and linked to the Americans. But quite quickly after South Vietnam's creation, things started to go awry, and this must have puzzled Americans, at least the ones that were paying attention. Not many of them were at this point. Most Americans at this point, say 1957, 58, 59, probably couldn't even have found Vietnam on a map. But those that were paying attention, those few, must have been puzzled, because the American press, the U.S. government, was saying that South Vietnam kind of looks like this. It's a bright and shiny experiment in capitalist democracy, even though it wasn't a democracy. Right? This is an example. I used this before as sort of a model country that the U.S. sort of lifted up and advertised. If you play our game, move in our direction, not the Soviet direction, we will protect you and promote you, and you can have all of this. But so Americans who had been learning that must have scratched their heads when they saw assassinations of South Vietnamese leaders, cars exploding, rigged with bombs. You see on the right the aftermath of it. Buddhist monks lighting themselves on fire. This is a famous picture, but there were others that did it as well. So Americans would be scratching their heads if they were paying attention, because be like, wait a minute, if this is such a shining experiment in democracy, why are so many officials being assassinated in Saigon? Why is there so much violence there? And why are Buddhist monks lighting themselves on fire and committing suicide? All good questions. So the answer is that things weren't what they seemed on the surface. The advertising done by the U.S. Was a lot different than the reality. But what you see here in these pictures is really kind of twofold. One, very quickly, the South Vietnamese, at least a portion of them, formed their own indigenous movement, which was also communist, which quickly had links to Ho Chi Minh's government and country in North Vietnam, but it did start up separately, even though it was Marxist and communist. This became known as the National Liberation Front, and or the Viet Cong, as is sort of more popularly known in the United States. And they started a civil war right away. Indigenous South Vietnamese saying, this government is not legitimate, so much so we're going to start a civil war and fight to overthrow it as best we can. The second part of this, which gets us to the monk on fire here, is that President Diem began to persecute Buddhists. Diem was one of 10% of the Vietnamese who were Catholics, going back to the French influence when Vietnam was a colony of France. So this not a wise idea on the part of the president. If you're the president, this is good advice for everybody in here. If you want to be the ruler of a country someday, it's a joke. But if you're ruling a country that's 90% Buddhist, you probably don't want to persecute the 90%. But he did, and this violence, this dramatic and extreme way of protesting, monks lighting themselves on fire was one of the results. So he started Diem started his term as president unpopular and became increasingly unpopular with the majority of his own population. The Civil War then was underway, raging from the end of the 1950s on. The United States also then helped to fund, just like it had funded the French in trying to get their colony back after the war. So in both cases, what they have in common is the United States does not want to lose all or some of Vietnam to the communists. So not, I think, unpredictably here, the United States gradually started to have to kind of do more of the heavy lifting to fight against communist incursions. Again, increasingly from North Vietnam as well, cooperating with indigenous South Vietnamese Viet Cong. This group of, in some ways, ragtag fighters became legendary for their tenacity, for their bravery, and for just their grit as tough soldiers. A lot of American troops, that went over during the 60s, came to have grudging respect for this very, very tough enemy. After Eisenhower left power and left office, and Kennedy was elected, the American presence in Vietnam actually increased. The Eisenhower administration has started sending advisors to Vietnam. Advisors kind of with two, air quotation marks, because advisors ended up sometimes being pilots who flew planes on combat missions against the Viet Cong, fighting for and with the South Vietnamese government of President Diem. Eventually, troops and officers that sometimes commanded operations was still with mostly South Vietnamese troops, but this fairly quickly was more than just advisors. And President Kennedy ended up sending more advisors, and year by year, from the late 50s into the early 60s and beyond, the number of advisors basically increased every year. Although there's some body of opinion among scholars that claims that Kennedy was trying to get the United States out of Vietnam, and had he lived, he would have. There's even some speculation. The movie JFK took this position, though I don't think it's well-founded in fact and evidence. That's one of the reasons that JFK was assassinated, that certain leaders within the government, whoever they were, didn't want the president. He thought it was dangerous for the president to pull America's commitment from Vietnam, so they assassinated him so that his successor, who would be Lyndon Johnson, would be more likely to be aggressive and stay in Vietnam. That part, I think, is almost certainly not true. But the idea that Kennedy was trying to get us out of Vietnam, I think, is also ridiculous, though it's a little more arguable. The evidence to me seems pretty clear that even his supporters would have to admit the statistics look like that he was escalating American commitment in Vietnam, not de-escalating it. So this is another area of Kennedy's presidency. I mentioned this in class. We talked about his time in the White House, more specifically, that he kind of gets a free pass oftentimes, partly because he was assassinated and because he was sort of this glamorous president, and his wife started this myth about Camelot. So some of this, I think, plays into the view that he was such a good guy, he would have gotten us out of Vietnam. I don't think the evidence is at all good on that score. So the United States started to recognize reluctantly President Johnson, who succeeded President Kennedy after the assassination, didn't want to go to war in Vietnam. Nobody really did, but they felt we have no choice. Number one, to continue with containment of the Soviet Union and communism, and two, that allies in Asia and around the world, if they saw us backing away from our commitments, they would be less comfortable trusting us, and then might make alliances with other countries like communist China and the Soviet Union. So this is, I think, the biggest reason why this was seen as a priority, since today many Americans, most of them, think that the whole Vietnam episode was for no reason or no good reason. And that could be true, but I think you can argue that there was legitimate worries about both of those things: communism in Asia or Southeast Asia, and how it would look to allies if we backed away from the commitment to defending South Vietnam. But as that civil war raged, American leaders realized more and more that the South Vietnamese army was becoming less and less effective against the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops, and that it eventually became then even clearer that for this to work, for South Vietnam to stay out of the hands of the communists, the U.S. would have to introduce ground troops in Vietnam. And this brings us to the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, which ended up being a pretext for war. American ships were patrolling off the coast of North Vietnam, certainly not innocently. They were very close to the coast and gathering intelligence. That's clear. And they were fired on by North Vietnamese vessels. And none of the ships got hit. There were no casualties. But President Johnson, his administration, used this as kind of an excuse to say, hey, look, they fired at us. They've basically started a war. And we have no choice now but to defend ourselves. Otherwise, we'll look weak in the eyes of the rest of the world. We're taken advantage of again and again. So this is the pretext that began became known as the escalation of American ground forces there. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution, passed overwhelmingly by both houses of Congress, only a few dissenting votes, pretty much gave the president a blank check to counter communist aggression in Vietnam with military force. Later on, some congressmen would claim that this hadn't been a blank check, that they'd been lied to some degree, or they wouldn't have supported it at all. And that could be true. But the other side is that the Congress did authorize this, and they did so overwhelmingly. So I do think if there's blame to go around, though much of it, maybe most of it, lies with President Johnson, certainly some of it lies with the congressmen who, again, in a very one-sided vote, did support this, at least at the time. So escalation, a term still used by historians that sees the American troop commitment going up. So in 62, 63, 64, you see small numbers. That's when they were still thought of as advisors, called advisors. 1965, after the Gulf of Tonkin incident and resolution, then you start to see American ground troops, about 180,000 by 66, a little less than 400,000, and by 1968, topping at over 500,000, and then going down from there in became known as de-escalation or Vietnamization of the war. It looks like the war, America's commitment to the war, is declining from 1969 on. That's a little misleading. We'll come back to that. But it is true that American troop levels started to go down during the Nixon administration, who did start to pull American units out of that country. American ground troops in Vietnam had a difficult time from the beginning. The guerrilla armies, guerrilla fighters of the Viet Cong were extremely elusive, extremely difficult to fight against. And fighting against guerrilla armies and tactics can be demoralizing, partly because you hardly ever know where the enemy is. They pop up in one place, fire a few rounds, disappear, come up, find out somewhere else, and they don't take territory, at least permanently. One of the ways, in conventional, traditional warfare, you know you're winning is depending on how far inside the country you're attacking is. So, okay, we've taken, this much of the country's territory, a fourth of it, a month into the war, and then 2 months in, we took their capital, and so we're on our way to victory. But the Viet Cong didn't necessarily hold ground, and so how much territory you controlled wasn't really a marker of whether you're winning the war or not. So American troops had this sort of disillusioning experience of sort of not knowing if they were winning, how they might be winning, what they were kind of doing overall. So and they were sent on incredibly dangerous missions. The South Vietnamese population were caught in the crossfire in this war. But it is true that sometimes the Viet Cong, to sort of blend in when Americans, were in the vicinity, would get out of their fighting uniforms and sort of don peasants' garb. So American troops were on edge much of the time because they never knew who was sort of friendly peasants, friendly, just average citizens, and who might be Viet Cong. And it did lead to some terrible violence, some atrocities committed by the U.S., but American troops were under a great deal of pressure and filled with lots of confusion. General William Westmoreland was the general in charge of this war effort. He's often criticized and sort of shoulders lots of the blame for the war, which he probably deserves. He didn't use what are called counterinsurgency techniques, not nearly enough. Counterinsurgency means that counter a guerrilla, kind of using guerrilla tactics back on guerrillas to beat them. He tended to do what the United States was good at doing and used to doing, which is just hit the other side with overwhelming firepower. That can work against guerrilla forces, but it doesn't always work. Again, because they're just so elusive and hard to find. You end up, dropping a lot of bombs, firing a lot of rounds, and coming up with little to show for it. This eventually kind of started to become a war of attrition, each side kind of trying to grind down the other, and this became part of the difficulty and what became demoralizing about the war as well.